John Pesutto, good to talk to you. Thank you for coming by.
My pleasure, Virginia.
And of course, this is terrible news coming out of Auckland.
Tragic, and we hear about it all too often, don't we?
Yeah, it's an enormous worry. We don't only have those details at the moment, but do you imagine that might cause some security issues here in Australia as well? It seems to be just linked to that site, at least from what we understand right now in Auckland.
Well, let's hope so, but I think these days we have to be vigilant wherever there are large crowds, and it'll heighten security assessments, I'm sure. But my thoughts and sympathies and condolences go out to the victims and their families.
A lot to get through here this morning, sure. But of course top of mind is the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games here in Victoria. You've asked the Auditor-General to urgently investigate the costs incurred by the cancellation. I think you're making that referral. They won't be able to do that surely until we are well through the compensation process and the negotiations going on in London, though.
There'll be a lot of things that won't be settled for some time, but the scale of this debacle is in some ways incomprehensible. I was trying to liken it to something in recent Victorian political history, and I probably go back to the State Bank well before I was involved in politics. There are questions about why the bid was made, why we went hunting for it in 2021, it now seems, why we secured it with, obviously, as it now appears to be the case, without a proper assessment of the cost benefits to be associated with it. I think there's a view now that given the parlous state of Victoria's budget, it's probably the only thing you can do. But that's not the most important question. The question is, why did we get into this mess, and what processes around government were engaged to get here? And it does involve the Auditor-General, but I want to make it clear for all of our listeners, there'll be other modes of inquiry that will be necessary here, and I actually imagine that part of this may feature into the Ombudsman's inquiry into politicisation of the public service as well.
I want to get to some questions around what you've just raised there and what the consequences are and should be or should not have been. But around the issue of going seeking for it or securing it in the first place, I didn't really hear any voices of opposition or complaint raised at the time when the government announced that we were going to get it. Most people were happy to hear about that.
Absolutely, and why wouldn't we? We're entitled, I think, myself included, we're entitled to rely on the representations and assurances governments give us. And if the government of Victoria tells us, the Victorian people, that they think it will cost $2.6 billion, they put it in the budget papers as recently as 7 weeks ago, we're all entitled to rely in good faith on that. So I think it's fair to say, people like the idea of regional Victoria being the chief beneficiaries of the activity and the tourism that will be associated, and the infrastructure investment in social housing and sporting facilities. That was a good thing. We all like that, but we trusted in the truth of the figures that the Andrews government was telling us about, and that's proven to be a complete con.
Well, yes, except for the fact that now you're hearing comments such as, well, they should have always known, the budget was already in a parlous state, the financial challenge was big, the cost of living was rising, inflation was on the up, we already had a shortage when it came to staff and labour, when it came to building and to security. So it's all very well to say now that they shouldn't have gone hunting for it when everyone, including the opposition, greeted that with enthusiasm at the time. So it's convenient to turn around now and be critical, isn't it?
No, it's fair to do so, I think, Virginia, really.
And convenient.
Well, it's fair because if the government says we can afford to do this, this is the envelope, we're confident we can host it.
Weren't you able to look at the budget position then and go, and hang on a minute, no, and say, you know that no games, either Commonwealth or Olympics, ever stays within the boundary that's being suggested at the time. They always overspill. We can't afford it.
But the policy corollary of that, Virginia, is you'd never host anything. If the government says, as recently as 7 weeks ago, this is the envelope, I think we're all entitled in good faith to rely on, and it turned out to be wrong. And the questions that begin that inquiry are, how did we get to that point? How does the government and the public service produce an outcome like that in the first place? And the other thing around the costings is that, one, that's being disputed now by the Commonwealth Games Association and the Federation as well internationally. But I just want to flag this because it's a concern I've got, and obviously it will depend on the inquiries afoot now that we're trying to initiate. Weren't you a little curious, because I certainly was, when the federal government in its budget announced funding for the Olympic Games for Brisbane, but no funding for the Commonwealth Games? And it's now clear why the Andrews government didn't arc up about that. And one thing I want the inquiry to uncover is, when did they know that they weren't going to be able to host the games ultimately?
And you're suggesting that they informed the federal government before the federal government put its budget together that they weren't going to pursue it? Is that what you're suggesting?
That's one of the things I want to find out about, because I now think one of the important questions is, just when did you know? Because those budget papers, as with all budget papers, are audited and signed off.
You're talking federal budget
state
papers
budget papers as well. Yeah. They're all signed off. And when I talk about the need to look at processes, politicisation of the public service, this is a debacle of a scale which now, in my mind, raises questions about, were proper and normal processes around the costings for these types of major events, were they in some way subverted to get to this point?
John Pesutto, if you learned that the price of the Commonwealth Games that you committed to was about to double and more, you would have had to bail too, wouldn't you? I mean, you couldn't look me in the eye and say a promise is a promise and we're pushing ahead.
I think the fair starting point, though, Virginia, is what would you do back in, February 2022 when you were bidding for
We
that?
talked about that a moment ago, and I've got a question about that coming up. But on this issue, once you discover that it's actually going to be a hell of a lot more, and you've got a budget position like that, in all good conscience, you would have bailed too.
I don't think Daniel Andrews gets any elephant stamps for putting us in this position. That's the first thing.
Again, that's not my question.
Yeah, but you're putting to me, I can understand why you're doing it. You're putting to me a scenario that Daniel Andrews has put us all in, and then asking me what would I do in that scenario. And my response is, I wouldn't allow that scenario to materialise in the first place.
But there is that part of it that you understand. When you get to that level and you've got a budget position like this, you can't possibly push ahead, correct?
Look, I think it's reasonable to say that if I were Premier today and took office today and was confronted with that, I would probably have no choice but to do what's been done. Yes, I don't think that's what's caused so much anger and has generated that reaction globally to what's happened. I think the real question Victorians are asking, how do you get us into this position in the first place, as if our money is monopoly money, and now we've got to face a bill? What could it be? $1 billion or more? Who knows?
Well, that's my question to you. So, do you have a hypothesis? Do you have a suspicion as to why Daniel Andrews and the government pursued this in the first place?
Look, my theory would be, and it's to be tested by the inquiry, I think it was all about the 2022 election and wanting to get a jump on that. Made representations to the Victorian people, the international community for that matter, that we were going to be the proud host of this, that it was going to be a regional games, which, attracted a lot of support for the obvious reason, because regions have been neglected. So there was an obvious case for saying, if the region's going to benefit, this could be a good thing too. We're hosting a major event. We are a proud, capital of major events in our state.
But are you suggesting, you're saying for political purposes there for the election, but are you further suggesting that the Premier and the state government never had any intention of delivering it?
I don't know the answer to that question, to be fair.
But are you actually including that as a possibility?
I think they were reckless as to whether they could afford it, and I think they raced here. Look, you've heard me go on about the suburban rail loop for the same reason. Is there a proper business case? What analysis has there been? It's part of a pattern of the way the Andrews government seems to operate, that it's a small, closed circuit group of people, and they make big decisions without proper input from public sector agencies and stakeholders. And that's, I think, what drives a lot of the agitation and exasperation about, here we are again in a position where you're cancelling something and we're paying a price. It's not just the reputational damage from cancelling it. We're actually going to have to pay a financial penalty for this.
I understand you're about to release a tax discussion paper next week, a total review, you say, of state taxes. What taxes could and can be reviewed?
Well, we'll look at everything. Our aim will be to reduce taxes wherever we can. We've said we'll already abolish the schools tax because we don't think that's fair, and we think it's a responsible thing that we can say right now. The other taxes are quite significant in the impact they'll make on the economy and on investment, so we'll need to look more closer to the election about that. But what this is about is cost of living relief. It's about how can we look at our tax system to make it work so that we're reducing the burden but driving investment in Victoria, which is the key to growth. Tax isn't the key to growth. If you want to grow, you've got to attract investment. And we know now, including from testimony given by bank chiefs to the federal parliament last week, that even they are saying that there'll be big impacts on their payroll because of these taxes.
One quick like question before you go. Do you think it's important, or is it just a media beat up, that the Premier should apologise to the athletes that have been inconvenienced by this? Does that matter? Is that material?
Would for Daniel, would the sky fall in on him if he just apologised to the athletes? Is it a big thing to ask him to do? They've invested years in participating, and for those of us who don't compete, we might not understand the tribulations that go with the ups and downs that go with training for a major event. Is it that much of an ask to say to him, just apologise to them?
John Pesutto, good to see you, and you'll be stopping by monthly for a conversation.
Absolutely.
Be great to have you. Thanks so
Pleasure.
much. John Pesutto is the state opposition leader and the